Mr. Ambassador, let's talk about the speech, the historic nature of the speech. And yes, the ad-libbed lines, which actually, as far as PSYOPs goes, was the most important part of the speech. Because I'm wondering, Mr. Ambassador, if it's not nice for once that it is not Vladimir Putin defining the terms of the debate and keeping us guessing, but instead it's Vladimir Putin who's wondering whether he has to sleep with one eye open.
Well, first, Joe, I thought it was a fantastic speech. It was a very important speech. It laid out the difference between democracy and dictatorship, between good and evil. He was clear as day where he stood and where the Western world needed to stand. I hope it will be followed up with more action. That's what Kiev wants. That's what President Zelensky wants. But I think it was a very historic speech and the right speech. And the last part, I would just say a couple of things. First of all, it's not the first time President Biden has said this. I traveled with him in Moscow when he was the vice president. And in March of 2011, he said President Putin, Prime Minister Putin back then, should not run for a third term. He said it back then. This is nothing new. And he spoke out loud when I think hundreds of millions of people around the world, including, by the way, millions of Russians, also think. And third, let's be very clear. People jump from he should not remain in power to saying that he called for regime change. That is not true. He didn't say we should have a regime change. He said this one person should not remain in power. And most certainly he wasn't changing U.S. policy by advocating a policy of regime change. So all in all, I think it was, it wasn't in his speech. He's known to do this. But sometimes saying these things have a purpose. As you just rightly pointed out, when Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire back in 1983, and everybody said, oh my goodness, this is shocking what he said. Now we all remember that as a very clear statement of the truth back then.
And it's in a very strong message, Admiral Stavridis, to dissidents in Russia. And you heard after the fall of the Soviet Union, you heard dissidents saying that when Reagan and other Western leaders would say things like that, it sent a strong message. And by the way, as far as Joe Biden saying things like this, you don't have to go back to 2011 or 2012. He said it at the end of his State of the Union address, and it was clearly planned. As he's walking away from the mic, he says, let's go get him. A clear PSYOPs message to Vladimir Putin.
Joe, first and foremost, as you point out, there are different audiences here. You're absolutely right. There's a Russian audience, which, let's face it, is kind of split between those who support Putin, but many, and their numbers are growing, who do not support Putin. So I think that's a strong part of this. Secondly, it's the Europeans who come away from this reassured. I mean, my phone bangs from friends in NATO days as Supreme Allied Commander absolutely lit up at this speech, and it will continue to do so. It was a speech of immense reassurance to our allies. And then finally, Joe, I think it was a good explanatory speech to the American public, one that soared into the rhetoric of why this matters, hope and light, democracy. And I think he laid it out strongly, and he delivered it strongly. And then finally, when I think back on this speech, I'm not going to be thinking about, did he call for regime change or not? I think Mike McFaul describes that one very well. To me, this speech is called the sacred obligation speech. He talked about our sacred obligation to NATO, and it will also be the don't even think about it speech, kind of the American vernacular. Don't even think about it, Vladimir. I think a strong speech and delivered in a context in Warsaw, a city destroyed in the Second World War and rebuilt. We don't want that again. I think it was a strong speech and sent the right messages.
And David, you wrote some beautiful words about this speech afterwards, about the clear lines that it drew. It's so interesting, though. A lot of the bad faith actors on the Trump right who have been criticizing Joe Biden for being too weak, now criticizing Joe Biden for being too strong, and really revealed themselves after that speech for just how pathetic and how un-American they are in attacking the American president in a time like this. Let's talk about, though, your reaction to it and how you believe that Joe Biden finally did divide the world again against democracy, against the forces of autocracy.
Well, Joe Biden has been speaking since the campaign about a world divided between the forces of democracy and the forces of autocracy. And, of course, what we've seen in Ukraine is a flare-up in that conflict. And I think it was extremely important that he went right up to the edge of the dividing line that now sits across Europe. And he said, we are going to stand up to this. We are going to fight for this. We are going to support Ukraine. We are not going to be cowed. You know, past administrations have been hesitant to stand up to Putin. He was not hesitant to stand up to Putin. I think the message of the speech from beginning to end was of strength. And I also think that it was a speech that resonated not just in the context of Ukraine, but in the context of a shift. The United States and Europe and our allies are looking at Russia in terms of a long-term threat. They are not going to be satisfied simply to end this war, hopefully to win this war, but they are going to require that Russia stays where it is, that it stops its talk of aggression. And I think finally, as to your first point about the incredible hypocrisy of the Republicans who've taken both sides of this issue, as they had so many others, that, you know, this dividing line between autocracy and democracy is not a remote foreign issue. We are fighting that war right here, right now, with people like Donald Trump and others in his party seeking to undermine American democracy and embrace hallmarks of authoritarian governments. So, historical speech, strong, and significant resonance both at home and abroad.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.